Hello everybody. Today we are going to discuss growth theory. And growth theory is, as I already mentioned last time, about the long run economic behavior. So we are not studying the business cycle ups and downs. We are looking to the long run economic trend, growth, economic growth. And the theory we'll study is called the Solow growth model, which is basically the starting point and the benchmark in economic growth theory, which is, by the way, a huge subfield in macroeconomics. So what are the questions we are going to address? Well, we ask the question, what are the factors, the determinants of long-run economic growth? Why do grow some countries faster in the long run than other countries? And we want to have a kind of explanation, a consistent model that explains what is the main factor behind economic growth. These are the key topics we are going to address in this class today. So my outline consists of these 5 points. First, we will discuss about the long-run economic growth behavior. So I show you some patterns, graphical patterns, pictures. Then we study what we call growth accounting, which gives us a first insight of the factors of economic growth. And then we move on with the first macroeconomic model we discuss in this class, and that is the Solow model of economic growth. We will have first a kind of introduction, which is a little bit more mathematically, but you will see it's necessary to get a deeper understanding. But then, as soon as we have a final description of this model in one equation, we translate this equation into a graph, and we continue by a graphical discussion like supply and demand in Econ 1, and probably that is what you are all looking for. And then at the end we will also discuss alternatives, because we will see immediately that the economic growth theory has limitations. And it's based on simplifying assumptions. Okay, so let me start with point 1. First, insight in economic growth. What is economic growth about? Well, we study economic growth and the determination of output, which is a synonym, as you know, from last week, because there is this linkage to the standard of livings. And I also mentioned last time that growth and GDP, when I talk about output or now economic growth, it's the change of GDP. And the GDP is to produce goods and services in a country within a certain period. And if we have growth, that means we are producing more and more every year. And due to the fact that this is linked to the standard of livings, well, we are looking for to have as a high growth as possible. The questions are, as I already said, well, we are looking for the factors behind growth. We are studying why are countries growing faster than other. And we are looking, is there a gap between rich and poor countries? And why are countries growing on a different level? And is it possible that the poor countries or the countries with slow economic growth catch up at some point to the rich one, to the industrialized one? Okay. Here's a graph that illustrates for a selected group of Euro area countries, France, Germany, Italy, and the United Kingdom, GDP from the 1950s to 2010. What we can see, well, GDP is growing. Yeah, it's the absolute value. It's not the growth rate so far. You know, the growth rate is based on the annual change from year to year. Then we have this business cycle pattern. Here we have the absolute GDP. In PPP is purchasing power parity. I will explain this in detail in a later class. It's just a kind of currency union which makes both all these numbers comparable. So what we can see, well, we have growth definitely in the long run. From this picture, I illustrate here on the horizontal axis real GDP per capita. Keep in mind, we are looking always to real GDP, as we discussed last week. Per capita means per worker, per head. And on the vertical axis, we have what we call life satisfaction. and you can say also happiness. And then we have many dots. Every dot is one country. And it's a combination of what is the GDP per head in this country and what is the life satisfaction in that country. And what we can see by just looking to the scatter plot, well, it seems to be there's a positive relationship. The higher the GDP per capita, the higher the life satisfaction in this country. Well, that's actually this relationship I already mentioned a minute ago. That there is this positive relationship between happiness or life satisfaction and GDP growth. And there's an estimation, which is the dashed black curve in the middle of this scatter plot, which is estimated just by a linear regression, which is illustrating this positive relationship because it's upward sloping. There's also a dotted curve, which is a nonlinear estimate, and both curves show, well, there is a positive linkage between GDP and life satisfaction. And therefore, it's important for policymakers to take a look to these variables, in particular to GDP growth, the topic of today. Here we have a graph which is illustrating GDP growth over a very long time horizon. It starts at year 0, the birth of Christ, and continues until 2000, 2000 years. And there are two important issues in this graph. First of all, on the horizontal axis, you also have GDP, and we also have illustrated the population size in this graph. The population size is illustrated here, which you see is exponentially growing. And the size of the ball, the circle, illustrates the GDP in dollars. And now take a look, and that is important to see from this graph. From almost the year 0 until 2600, 2700, there was almost no GDP growth. You see, the balls are almost the same until this age here, around 1700. And the population size, well, was almost the same until that year. But then thereafter, well, something changed. Population was growing exponentially, and GDP was growing. And that is what you can see in the increasing size of these little circles or balls. What has happened around this time period? Well, it was the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution changed these two issues. It changed, on the one hand, the GDP growth that was almost 0 over more than 1,700 years. And it changed also the population size. And we are going to study why has the Industrial Revolution, in particular, around that age, changed the situation. And one explanation is obvious. It has to do with technology, with technological progress. At that time, it was the development of the steam machine. And we will see in the end, in our Solow model, in our growth theory, that technology is the main driver, the key driver of long-run economic growth. And that is what you can already see from this graph. There's a second message I want to explain. And this is the following. Keep in mind that over this long time horizon, we are living now in a very particular time. We are living in a time of 300 years of economic growth, but most of the time, 1,700 years, if we look to this window, was a period of no economic growth, or almost no economic growth, in terms of GDP and in terms of the population. So there is the obvious question, well, we are living here in the past 300 years since the Industrial Revolution in a very special time period. Can this go on forever? Let's see. Okay. My next table is also giving you an overview to this question of economic growth. And here we look to GDP growth numbers for a selected group of countries over different decades. I start with the first decade, the 60s, 61 to 70, then the 70s, the 80s, and then the 90s. And then the last column here is just the average of economic growth over the whole time frame. So in this table, there are a lot of interesting information I want to discuss. First of all, what we can see immediately, if we look to the 60s here, that the growth numbers were around, let's say, 4.2 to 8.3, so around 4 or 5%. If we compare the numbers, the GDP growth numbers of the 60s with the 90s, well, it's obvious for everyone that in the 90s the growth numbers were lower, right? So there was a clear decline in the growth rates of the 60s, 10-year decade average, to the 90s. And one question we have to study is, why has this happened? What is behind this trend? And we will see it has to do with a kind of natural law in economics, and that is the law of diminishing returns. I will come back to this later on today. A second interesting feature is the following. If we look in the 60s again to the European countries, like Germany or France, and compare this, let's say, with the US or the UK, you already see that GDP growth numbers in the European countries, including Japan, by the way, and you will see why, there were relatively high growth rates in comparison to the UK and the US. And that has to do with the following fact. You know, Second World War stopped in the late 1940s. And mainly, European countries were affected. So all things were destroyed, in particular, obviously, in Germany, in Europe, and also in Japan. Less in the UK and less in the US. And therefore, well, Germany and France and the other European countries, they started then growing from a very low basis. And if you start from a very low basis due to this law of diminishing returns, which I already mentioned, well, growth is high in the beginning, and it slows down as long as you are growing. You get richer and richer. And due to the fact that the capital stock and the factory halls were less destroyed in the US, far away from this terrible event, growth rate in the US in the 60s were lower. In the 90s, you can see, well, they're quite similar, right? The gap between fast-growing countries, like in the 60s, and countries that grow with smaller rates is more similar now in the 1990s. So there was a convergence of countries like Germany, France, to countries like UK and the US. So here you get some important insights now from these numbers. What is behind economic growth? How does economic growth affect the different countries over time and across the countries? And now we are trying to get a more systematic understanding to these patterns by studying growth theory. That is our intention today. I just want to stress, before we start with more theory, growth theory is a long run. It's not the short run business cycle fluctuations. And we have to distinguish these two. We will discuss the short run business cycle fluctuations in another lecture, which is about business cycle theory. We will talk about the main factors of growth, and we will see that the input factors play a role, and productivity or technology.